The year is 1790, and the newly formed United States of America, still young and fragile, is facing a challenge that threatens its very survival. While the Revolutionary War had ended just 7 years prior, securing independence from Britain, the task of solidifying its control over its vast frontier was far from over. The Northwest Territory, a vast expanse of land stretching from the Ohio River to the Great Lakes, was contested ground, a flashpoint where the ambitions of the United States collided with the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples who had lived there for centuries. This is the story of America's first major military defeat, a sobering lesson in the harsh realities of expansion, diplomacy, and the complex relationships with Native American tribes. At the center of this conflict was the Northwest Indian War, a series of clashes between the United States and a coalition of Native American tribes. This coalition, often referred to as the Western Confederacy, was a united front of indigenous peoples who sought to protect their lands from encroaching American settlers. Led by Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, and other tribal leaders, the Confederacy fiercely resisted the intrusion into their ancestral lands. And their resistance culminated in one of the most devastating defeats in American military history, the Battle of the Wabash, also known as St. Clair's Defeat. But to truly understand this event, we must first go back to the roots of the conflict, to the fragile peace that existed after the American Revolution, and the ambitions that fueled the expansion westward. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the Revolutionary War, Britain ceded control of the Northwest Territory to the United States. This area was vast, encompassing modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. It was a critical region for the future of the fledgling United States, rich in resources and strategically vital for the country's expansion. But there was a problem. This territory was not empty. The land was home to numerous Native American tribes who had lived there for centuries, and they had little interest in relinquishing their homes to American settlers. For them, this was not just a matter of territory. It was a matter of survival. The Native Americans viewed the encroaching settlers as invaders, and their grievances were further amplified by Britain, which, despite losing the war, still maintained forts in the region and supplied the tribes with arms and ammunition. To the American government, however, the Northwest Territory represented the future. President George Washington and his administration believed that controlling this land was essential for the nation's growth, both in terms of securing its borders and opening up opportunities for settlement and economic development. Washington authorized the construction of a series of forts and outposts to assert American presence and began a process of surveying the land for future settlement. However, the presence of American forts and settlers inflamed tensions with the Native American tribes. Throughout the 1780s, skirmishes and raids were common, with both sides suffering losses. The United States initially attempted to negotiate treaties with the tribes, but these treaties were often ineffective, signed under duress, or disregarded entirely by both parties. By the late 1780s, it was clear that the conflict over the Northwest Territory would not be resolved through diplomacy alone. The tribes, under the leadership of warriors like Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, were not willing to cede their lands without a fight. And for the United States, securing control of the region became a national priority. In 1790, President Washington ordered a series of military expeditions to quell native resistance and establish control over the Northwest Territory. The first of these expeditions, led by General Josiah Harmar, was launched in the fall of that year. Harmar, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, was tasked with leading a force of about 1,500 men, mostly untrained militia, with the goal of destroying native villages and breaking their will to fight. But Harmar's expedition was a disaster. The militia, poorly trained and ill-prepared for combat in the dense forests of the frontier, was ambushed by native forces under the command of Little Turtle. The native warriors, skilled in guerrilla tactics and intimately familiar with the terrain, inflicted heavy casualties on Harmar's men, forcing the general to retreat. Harmar's defeat emboldened the Western Confederacy, who saw it as a sign of American weakness and rallied more tribes to their cause. In the wake of Harmar's failure, Washington recognized that the United States needed a more concerted effort to defeat the native coalition. He appointed Major General Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory, to lead a second expedition into the frontier. St. Clair was an experienced military officer, but the task ahead of him would prove to be far more difficult than he anticipated. In the fall of 1791, St. Clair began organizing his forces for a campaign deep into native territory. His objective was to build a series of forts along the Wabash River, which would serve as a launching point for future operations and a symbol of American control. But from the outset, St. Clair faced enormous challenges. His army, like Harmar's before him, was composed primarily of poorly trained militia, many of whom were inexperienced and ill-equipped for the rigors of frontier warfare. Supplies were scarce, and morale was low. Nonetheless, St. Clair pressed on, believing that a show of force would be enough to subdue the native resistance. In late October, St. Clair's army, numbering about 1,400 men, began its march into the wilderness. The going was slow, as the soldiers struggled through dense forests and swampy terrain, plagued by hunger and sickness. By the time they reached the banks of the Wabash River in early November, the army was exhausted and ill-prepared for what lay ahead. Unbeknownst to St. Clair, native scouts had been watching his every move. Little Turtle and Blue Jacket had gathered a coalition of around 1,000 warriors, drawn from several tribes, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on the morning of November 4th, 1791. Just before dawn, as St. Clair's men were beginning to stir, the native forces launched a surprise attack. The Americans were caught completely off guard. Little Turtle's warriors, using the cover of the forest, surrounded the American camp and opened fire. The militia, unaccustomed to such sudden and brutal combat, quickly fell into disarray. Despite St. Clair's attempts to rally his men, the native forces pressed their advantage, cutting down soldiers as they fled. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. American soldiers, unused to the terrain and overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the native assault, found themselves trapped. In some cases, the native warriors, armed with tomahawks and muskets, engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The sounds of battle, gunfire, war cries, and the screams of the wounded filled the air as St. Clair's army was systematically annihilated. By the end of the battle, St. Clair's army had suffered staggering losses. Out of the 1,400 men who had marched with him, over 900 were killed or wounded. It was a catastrophic defeat, the worst in American military history up to that point. The Battle of the Wabash, or St. Clair's defeat, marked the nadir of the American campaign in the Northwest Territory. The defeat at the Wabash River sent shockwaves through the young United States. The fledgling republic, still in its infancy, had suffered a humiliating military disaster, raising serious questions about its ability to protect its borders and secure its territorial ambitions. News of the defeat reached President Washington, who was both shocked and furious. He ordered an immediate investigation into the debacle and demanded accountability from those responsible. St. Clair, whose health had been deteriorating throughout the campaign, was forced to resign in disgrace. The defeat also prompted a rethinking of American military strategy in the Northwest. Washington and his administration realized that a more professional and better trained army was necessary to secure control of the frontier. This led to the creation of the Legion of the United States, a more disciplined and capable military force under the command of General Anthony Wayne. Wayne would go on to achieve a decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which effectively ended the Northwest Indian War and secured American control over the Northwest Territory. But the memory of St. Clair's defeat would linger, a sobering reminder of the challenges the United States faced in its quest for expansion and the resilience of the Native American tribes who fought to defend their homelands. In the end, the defeat on the Northwest frontier in 1791 was not just a military failure. It was a turning point in the young nation's history, one that highlighted the complexities of frontier warfare and the high cost of American expansion. It was a lesson learned through blood and sacrifice, a lesson that would shape the future of the United States and its relationship with the indigenous peoples of North America.